reckoned, same word, of grace, but of debt. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness, same word. Even as David also describeth the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputeth, same word, righteousness, without works, saying, Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. There's the 5 times out of the 11 in the rest of this chapter that this word, same word, is used. It's translated different ways, but it's the same word, legizomai, every time. It means the same thing. So what does this word mean? I'll just use the one translation of it right now, impute. What is this imputed righteousness? What does it mean? Because he says over and over again, in fact, the end of it says the man is blessed if the Lord will not impute sin. I mean, that's an important thing. What is this imputed righteousness? What's a description of imputed righteousness? I like another word for that, account, because it gives the idea of a ledger. It gives the idea of a transaction, and that's exactly what this word indicates. The original languages, they use this word to describe a transaction, a legal, financial transaction, an imputing, a reckoning. Not just a way of thinking, but an actual thing that happens. And therefore, the imputation of God's righteousness on sinners' account is an actual transaction made whereby God accounts Jesus' righteousness as sufficient to produce a right relationship with himself as God. This is important in understanding what this word means. It does not mean that God's perfect righteousness is imparted or given to the sinner. It doesn't mean the sinner becomes righteous. It is that the sinner doesn't become sinless, but rather that the spiritual account of the sinner who is storing up wrath, and by the way, that's me and that's you without Jesus Christ. The sinner storing up wrath, piling it on because of sin against God, is reckoned or accounted or imputed as being filled up with Christ's perfect righteousness. So the ground or the basis of God justifying sinners, justification, is Christ's sufficient sacrifice. The means of that justification. How does God justify sinners? By imputing or accounting our guilt upon Jesus while he was a man on the earth, and most specifically when dying on the cross. And simultaneously transferring or accounting or imputing Christ's righteousness upon us. It's a dual transaction. The method for obtaining that imputed righteousness, that being reckoned just, is by faith alone in the finished work of Jesus Christ. The result then is righteous living and future glory as holy ones, sanctified ones, saints. So, this letter shows this as Paul harks back to what the Old Testament teaches concerning Abraham. What does he say there? He says, we see that Abraham, the spiritual father, what did he find? What was it like for him? How was he righteous? I mean, no Jew would say Abraham was unrighteous. In fact, the Jews believed that Abraham became perfect. Now, we know he didn't. It was kind of the thing that legends are made of, though, right? The hero. And Abraham, they considered him righteous without even needing Christ's righteousness or God's righteousness. They basically idolized Abraham and made him into be a god. We know he needed it, and this verse even says that he needed it. He wasn't perfect. He did need God's righteousness. And so Paul says, okay, what about Abraham? There's a real righteous guy. He's your father. How was he justified? How was he declared right before God? And he points out something really interesting. He says, if he were justified, or if he were declared right by his works, by what he could do, you notice he says something shocking here. He says, he hath whereof to glory. He could boast. He could glory. But not before God. Think of it this way. I like this. This got me every time. I kept reading this over and over again and thought, this is really, really fascinating to me. And here's an illustration maybe how this might work today. Whoever you might be that's the most athletic member of Grace Baptist Church. I won't pretend to try deciding who that is. If you were to train hard, learn the skills of basketball, play us all one-on-one in a game of basketball, and handily beat us with your excellent prowess at the game, you might have something to boast in, right? You could probably stand up here and say, I am the best basketball player around. You actually have accomplished something, haven't you? Well, maybe not a lot, but you've accomplished something. But then, just let's say you sat down for dinner with Michael Jordan, Wilt Chamberlain, Kobe Bryant, and Larry Bird. What happens to your boasting then? You probably wouldn't bring up how you whooped me in basketball. First of all, these greats of the game would probably go, who? Or maybe you don't like the illustration of athletics. Think of this. Perhaps you're an excellent artist, and you could boast before many of us of your skills and abilities. And you could rightfully boast. I mean, you could rightfully glory. You have more skill than we have. But where would your boasting be when compared to Rembrandt and Leonardo da Vinci in the Sistine Chapel? Could you really take your picture you drew of your mom, put it up next to the Sistine Chapel and say, wow, eat your heart out, Leo? I mean, really, you have a point of boasting, right? Really? Before God, can anyone boast in their works? Before God, can anyone boast in their works? The one who works all things according to the counsel of his own will? What creation of good deed could we possibly boast in when standing before the one who created this entire world with the breath of his voice? How could we boast in feeding the poor when God miraculously orchestrated the water cycle to bring food? What farmer could boast in his crops before God? Who miraculously brings food into existence, who rained manna down from heaven. How could we boast before God? In light of the mighty Himalayas, what architect can boast? In the shadow of the oceans, what landscaper could glory in his duck pond? And so what man could boast or glory in keeping of laws to the perfect, sinless lawgiver upon whom all the laws of nature and morality and holiness depend? By him all things consist. This sentence is short but profound. He can boast, but not before God. But not before God. If you desire to do enough ritual and goodness and hard spiritual work and tithes and works, go ahead and boast that you are better than your neighbor. Boast that you are better than your spouse, but not before God. That's just embarrassing. So the description of imputed righteousness is God's perfect righteousness being put onto the repentant sinner's account because his guilt was put onto or imputed to Christ's account on the cross, but not by the sinner's good works. He can't boast before God. I can't boast before God. In fact, I know from the Scriptures that when I see God, I'll be able to do nothing but fall on my face before Him. And probably cry out and echoing with the seraphims and the cherubims, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Who can boast but not before God? Even Abraham the mighty could boast. In fact, he could probably boast in front of all the Jews that were there to read this letter of being more righteous than they. But before God, he has no boasting. The description of imputed righteousness is apart from works. The very nature of it being imputed means it can't be by works. It has to be given. It has to be put upon the account. In teaching or the dogma that the Old Testament proved righteousness was imputed, not earned, even when the law was given, even this law that they're holding on to, Paul uses Abraham as an illustration in a specific account of Abraham. The account Paul is talking about is a time when Abraham, a man called out of idolatry to serve the one true God, was aging. He was in his 80s when he's talking about in verse 3 here. Abraham's in his 80s. His wife was 10 years younger. So whatever the computation is, far beyond childbearing years. And God informs Abraham that through he and Sarah, the two of them, both beyond human ability, God would give them a son that would be heir to a great nation. Not only that, but this son that God would give them would bless all the ends of the earth through his seed. A very specific prophecy pointing to Jesus Christ himself, the coming Messiah. Genesis 15:16 is where we find this. Abraham believed God, and his faith was accounted, imputed, as the means of righteousness.